Welcome to Strictly Money at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'm your host, Saijal Patel. 21% of all Canadians will struggle with addiction at some point during their lifetime. That's according to the Canadian Mental Health Association. Addiction, whether that's to drugs, gambling, or something else, can grab a hold of some of the brightest and strongest and most caring individuals. And being married to an addict can also be financially devastating. While you can't control your partner's actions, you can find ways to protect your finances. Joining me now to share her insights is Lisa Gelman. Lisa is a lawyer and founder of Gelman Associates. Lisa, great to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I was quite surprised at the stat, 21%, which is around 6 million people. I didn't think that addiction was that prevalent, but we often, Lisa, we don't talk about the financial toll as a society, certainly not as openly as we would talk about the emotional toll that someone does face when they're in a relationship with someone who has an addiction. In your experience, why is it so important to pay attention to the finances?
Well, it's so important to pay attention to the finances because unfortunately, 50% approximately of all couples, whether married or not married, are going to separate in Canada. So that means even though you're hoping, and we all hope, that you're not going to separate, it's really important to pay attention to the money in order to be able to protect yourself in case, or even if not in case, a separation is going to happen. Because you've got to protect your money for your kids, for yourself, for your future.
What do partners, Lisa, need to understand in terms of their liability when it comes to being with someone that does have an addiction? And because I find that the situation is unique, right? Because I've seen this many times, people hope that that person will change. They promise that they'll change. And so they kick the financial piece sort of down the road.
Right. We hear that a lot, that everyone's going to change. And let's hope for the best, but let's plan for the worst is what we always think. And with the consequences, there's two types of consequences that I see. There's the family law related consequences of money, and there's who are you liable? For instance, if you have a joint visa with your spouse, even though you want to not pay for that debt that your husband, for instance, or your wife has incurred, necessarily that's not what's going to happen because, for instance, visa, they're not going to care that you're separated or staying together and didn't know about the debt. What they're going to care about is collecting on the debt. So you've got to be very careful to make sure that you review the statements every month and make sure that your spouse is spending within their limits and not unduly because of their addiction or other means. One piece of advice would be that if you do see that something's going not well, that you want to consider canceling that joint account. Unfortunately, not all companies will allow you to unilaterally just stop and cancel the account. You might have to get the permission of your spouse. So you really have to think hard before consenting to be on a joint liability such as visa.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I can see situations where saying, look, I've talked to my partner and they're not controlling their expenses. What can I do? So you have to take the step beforehand, don't you?
You sure do, because it could be too late after. Sometimes the bank will work with you and you can call the bank up and say, I want it to stop now. I want to close the visa. But not all banks will act like that because they want to be able to protect themselves. So really thinking twice about what you're going to be joint with your spouse, is really important, especially when we think about second marriages and when you've accumulated some wealth compared to, younger marriages or relationships.
Yeah, we have about a minute to the commercial break, Lisa. Is this bank accounts, I assume, work the same way? We talk about credit cards, but bank accounts too?
Generally speaking, bank accounts maybe not as scary because when you have a joint bank account, you can legally take out all the money. So if there was $10,000 in a joint account and you needed to protect yourself, you can take that money out. With family law, you're going to have to account for it later on. But the good thing is you can take it out to have a bit of a cushion for yourself.
Okay. What do people need to know about the person who has the addiction in terms of the personality?
I think it's really important that unfortunately you can't take for face value everything he or she says relating to everything, and especially with respect to your finances. So you've got to make sure if your spouse isn't being forthwith with you, that at least you've got the protection, like the cushion you need to do what you need to do for yourself and or your children.
Okay, we'll take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation because there's a lot more to talk about. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Lisa, let's assume that a partner is wants to stay in the relationship. You know, they're working through whatever issues they may have, so they're not ready to leave. What are some steps that they can take to protect their household finances? We've talked about sort of monitoring accounts, perhaps stopping the bleed if it means canceling things. What else can they do?
Two important things that we always advise. Number one being educate yourself. Some people, some couples are both educated about their assets and their partner's assets. Some people, you would be so surprised to have no idea what's going on with the financials. So education is very important. And the second thing is, as drastic as it may sound, it's not. If you've got actual assets in the house or in the apartment that you don't want being stolen or pawned by your spouse because of their addiction, hide them. We had one case where a female had teapots and silverware that was inherited from her mother, and so valuable. And she made sure to store them away because she was so scared that her spouse at the time was going to take them and pawn them off. Another one of my clients was not so forward thinking, and she refused to hide the gold bars that she had, and they miraculously went missing. And of course, the spouse at the time denied that he had anything to do with it.
Wow.
So protect your assets.
Yeah, I've seen situations like that as well, Lisa, and I'm sure many of our viewers can relate or probably have known people who've gone through this as well. Let me ask you, do they have to think about changing some of their big sort of estate planning documents like wills? Is this the time to think about things like that?
It's always a good time. You know, we don't do wills ourselves, but we're always telling our clients every year you should think about what your will says. And if you're happy with what it says in case, God forbid, something happens. And if you're not, with respect to your assets and or your children, you want to speak to and consult with a lawyer who deals with wills and estates.
Okay. What if they decide that they do want to leave the relationship? So they worked things, they can't work things out. It's not getting any better. What does the partner of the person who is addicted have to do and think about?
What's really important is to accumulate proof of all their assets and their liabilities, because one thing that the family law lawyer is going to tell them is that we have to figure out for them how much property, so to speak, or a value of that they're going to be entitled to. And we actually take a snapshot on the date of separation of all assets. And assets can include bank accounts, gold bars, pensions that need to be valued, the matrimonial home. So the more information you come equipped with to the lawyer, the better for that.
So this is really interesting. And you hit on something, Lisa. You actually have to file, I'm assuming, for a legal separation, and it's what you owe at that date, right? What you own and what you owe?
No, you don't actually file. A legal
Okay.
separation is when one party has the intention to separate.
Okay.
But on that day is the exact time that crystallizes the amount of the assets and debts. So we actually take a look at your bank accounts on that very day and see, and numbers can fluctuate because stocks can be one thing on December 5th and very different on December 7th. So the date of separation is very important.
Okay. Let's switch gears then and talk about the financial impact and divorce for, quote, I guess, normal situations. So where, the person, there is no addiction in the relationship. What do they need to think about then? Is it similar steps or is it different considerations?
Well, with respect to money, it's similar because the lawyers, pursuant to family law, at least in Ontario, are always going to look at the assets on the date of separation compared to the assets and debts on the marriage date. And we figure out for clients what they're going to walk away with or what they're going to have to pay. So again, knowing what you have, both debts and assets, even if you hold assets and or debts jointly with other people is really important. And knowing your cash flow, because knowing when I separate, I'm only going to have one household income and I'm going to potentially have to be paying out money to my spouse or ex-spouse. So can I make this work and how am I going to make it work?
Okay. We only have 30 seconds, Lisa. Just going back to, I guess, the addiction piece. If you are separating, is it like a no-fault situation? Like I know some people say, well, he or she caused the problem, which means the ruling will be in more of my favor.
No, it's a myth. It's a no-fault system, both with affairs and money. Basically, you've made the decision to be with this person. So until the date of separation, the monetary affairs are going to be considered under the family law.
Okay, we'll take another quick break. We'll be right back. Lisa, how important are prenups and cohabitation agreements? And are they more common today?
Absolutely, they're more common today. And frankly, the stigma that we're seeing is gone, especially with second divorces, because usually we see with second divorces, people are a bit older or much older. They've accumulated some more income, more money, and they need to protect what they're coming into the marriage with. We hope the marriage will be forever, but we know 50% of them fail, unfortunately. So you need to protect your assets.
So prenups, I mean, you didn't hear much about prenups in the past. So they are more common now?
We didn't hear a lot about it, and it was hush hush and
Yeah.
stigma.
Yeah.
It's commonplace now. There's no stigma as far as we're concerned, and we're seeing so many more. And even people who don't have a lot of money but are anticipating growth in the future and the potential breakdown of the marriage, thinking, I don't want to in the future split what I've made myself during the marriage.
And the cohabitation agreements, is it similar to a prenup? Because a lot of people aren't getting married, Lisa. They're living together. So
absolutely, a cohabitation is similar. There's different rights it may protect, but the great thing about a cohabitation agreement is if the parties who sign that decide to get married in the future, it automatically morphs into a prenup. So you don't have to go back to the lawyer's office again.
okay. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see when someone's even entering a marriage, I guess, right? Because if 50% of relationships, end, I'm sure you see a lot of cases where they're thinking, if I knew this, I would have done things differently.
Right. A lot of people don't realize that if they come into the marriage with a matrimonial home that they owned before the marriage, that they think I'm not going to have to split it, and that's wrong. Basically speaking, the second you get married, if you have a matrimonial home that was purchased even before the marriage, you're going to have to, divide half of it up when you separate. And with housing prices today, we know that's a lot of money. So you need to protect the matrimonial home when you're getting married.
So that is where the cohabitation agreement comes in, or prenup. Can that protect it?
Both can protect it, yes.
Oh, okay.
The bottom line is before you're getting married or moving in with someone, you need to speak to a lawyer.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting because most of us, I think, are attached to our homes, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, and for most of us, it's the biggest asset that we either own or will ever own in the future.
Let's talk about the financial burden of getting divorced. I know I've seen this many times. There's the legal costs, of course, but there's also the impact of the assets and properties getting divided.
Right. Well, first of all, with respect to legal costs, lawyers, as we know, are expensive. And one of the most important things when choosing a lawyer is not to choose someone who's going to be an aggressive shark. We hear that all the time. Both sides want to have a lawyer that knows what they're doing and will represent fairly, because otherwise, nothing but skyrocketing law, like bills, are going to climb, and you don't want to throw unnecessary money into the lawyers. So make sure you do your research on lawyers with, good reputations and good reviews.
Did the COVID situation and the pandemic situation change things? Because you heard a lot about Zoom meetings and Zoom sessions, and is that still happening? I'm just wondering about the impact of the costs for that and whether it's still happening.
Right. There were some great things, not a lot, but that came out of COVID. One of them was that a lot of court, if not all of court at one time during COVID, was via Zoom. And this was fantastic. Our fees went down tremendously. So rather than a day at court being $4,000, it was an hour jumping onto a Zoom for $400 an hour. Some courts are still doing that, and you can ask for permission sometimes. But unfortunately, a lot of courts, the presumption is going back to in person. I'm actually on a committee with one of my associates fighting to have Zoom, be presumptive because it's so much easier and less effective.
So that's crazy. So you're saying like that's a big difference, Lisa, 4,000 versus 400. Why the difference?
Because you're talking about travel charges and you're talking about sitting around in a court all day. Lawyers charge for that. Whereas if we have a Zoom, like you and I, we can jump onto a Zoom and it's an hour in and an hour out. So we're only billing for, say, 1 hour versus 10 hours of travel time there and back and sitting around for 9 hours in court. It's a waste of everybody's time.
Wow. And I can imagine, I think some people would actually prefer Zoom meetings because they don't have to face the person that they're in conflict with as well.
Absolutely. And especially cases with domestic violence. The person who's alleging domestic violence does not want to be near the other person. So, in my opinion, Zoom was great and is great.
Okay, we'll take another break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Lisa, we've been talking about the financial burden of getting divorced. One of the things that I am seeing a lot more of is gray divorces. And I have to imagine that the financial burden there is tenfold.
It's expensive. And at a latter part in our lives, we have to worry about potential medical costs and a lot more costs that we had to think about earlier on. So it's really important, once again, it all comes back to planning before you get in the relationship, planning before you move in, and planning prior to the separation. And a really good thing to do is speak to a lawyer who deals with family law and wills and estates. That will help a lot.
What are the big mistakes that people make, though, when they're in their 50s and 60s? Because at that point, you could be probably dividing the house, but there's pension assets that you have to think about, and you're going into retirement. What are mistakes that either partners make, whether it's maybe walking away or not negotiating enough or something else?
Right. I think the person that's walking away needs to be educated because he or she, for instance, may not even know that her ex-spouse's pension is worth hundreds of $1,000s, if not $1 million. We deal with a lot of police, teachers, ambulance. Like you need to be educated. So a huge mistake is not getting proper legal advice.
Would the lawyer know that, though? Like your lawyer, would they understand that and fight for you? Because on the other side, if you're dealing with a partner who is aggressive, right? Like I've seen situations where they're so aggressive and frankly manipulative that the other person is fearful and just kind of says, well, no, I don't want to, I just want to walk away.
Absolutely. And that's when we see a lot of people who are scared, and we encourage these people, not only to arm themselves with the education that we provide, but lean on their friends, lean on a therapist, go to a therapist if they haven't, because if they walk away, this could be one of the biggest mistakes of their lives. I've had one person who was scared to claim spousal support, even though she had been the stay-at-home mom the entire time, because her adult children were making her feel guilty because of the ex-spouse. And I convinced the parties that this was not fair, that my client needed to be protected and needed to be able to live. So guilt is not something that comes easy, and you want to speak to someone so you make sure you don't make the wrong decisions and walk away because of guilt.
And personalities matter, right? I mean, you and I have talked about this sort of offline about the narcissistic personalities.
The narcissist, we get tons of calls for, you'll never believe it, that he's the worst narcissist or she's the worst narcissist. We see that this often, especially because we're dealing with separation and divorces. We know how to deal with narcissists, and we help the clients. One good piece of advice is that we recommend to clients that although we're empathetic and we're here to help, and we understand it's one of the worst times in their lives, to save costs, because lawyers charge between $300 to $1,000 an hour. Have a therapist, have friends who you can speak to about the pain emotionally and the trauma, because that will be less expensive and you can concentrate more with the lawyer on the legals and get places you need to go and keep your legal fees down.
Lisa, we have a minute left till the end of the show. When does mediation work? And when should someone consider it? Yeah, when should they consider it?
Mediation should be considered at all times. Mediation can even happen after the court process starts, and we encourage it. The key is you need to have two parties consenting to this. You can't mediate unless your ex-spouse says, I'm on board. But mediation can get things done a lot quicker. You get to choose who makes the decisions for you rather than having a judge, make a decision. And, it can be a lot less expensive and quick than the legal process.
For those who are watching this and maybe considering separating, what's one piece of advice that you would give them?
Have a consult. You can call up a lawyer, have a free consult with a good family law lawyer who can tell you what you're entitled to and can help you plan and set the proper steps and motions for that separation.
Okay. Lisa, we really appreciate your time today. Thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.
Lisa Gelman is a lawyer and founder of Gelman Associates. We've come to the end of the show. If there's a financial topic you'd like to learn about, drop us an email. And if you're a woman and you'd like to learn how to manage your finances better, whether it's saving more money or investing or protecting your wealth, I'd love for you to join my free money masterclass. I've taught tens of thousands of women how to design their financial freedom blueprint, and I'll teach you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.